All right, we're excited now to be joined once again by David Sirota. David, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so you recently did a midterm breakdown on Lever Time, your podcast over at The Lever with Chris Hayes. And I think both of us, we were talking before we queued the segment up, are interested to hear if there are any interesting or just like maybe fresh takeaways that Chris Hayes has as he's looking at some of these races.
Sure. I mean, one thing that he said was that I asked him the question, why have Democrats kind of avoided or been silent on economic issues? And I think he made a good point, because I'm somebody who's always been like, the Democrats need to be making an economic case, whether the economy's decent or terrible. And the economy right now is rough. And he said, I think he made a good point that, I think that the Democrats had a big advantage on abortion. Then the Dobbs issue came. And political parties have kind of an inherent desire, an inherent inkling to try to focus on the issues where polls already show they have an advantage. Of course, the danger is that no matter what issue you may have an advantage on, it may not necessarily match up with what voters think the election is actually about. And in the middle of an inflation crisis, the election is inherently going to be about inflation. And he made the point, which I also thought was a good point, was that, look, obviously the Republicans have an easier time of making an economic argument to the point where, there was like that tweet that went around of Todd Young, the senator from Indiana. It was just like Todd Young in front of a gas pump. And that was it. Like, that was the only thing. Just like you're just pumping gas and like the price sucks and that's it, right? And so and Chris made that point that all the Republicans have to do is just show a picture of that, right? And so I would agree that it is a more complicated, or at least a two-step argument that the Democrats have to be making on inflation. But what's unbelievable is that the Democratic Party doesn't get a lot of fossil fuel money. The fossil fuel industry that's reporting record profits is fueling inflation. There is a compelling argument that the Democratic Party could be making about the Republicans defending their big oil donors from stuff like price gouging legislation that the House passed. And I know, Ryan, The Intercept had reported that the Democrats, the DCCC, had come up with some ads making that inflation case, but those ads were never broadly aired as a campaign message.
Right. I think Andy Kim ran one, Matt Cartwright ran one, but Pat Ryan did some corporate power stuff, and yes, the DCCC tested a bunch of this stuff. The tests came back like, this works, as you would expect. But we're not seeing a ton of it. There's a real pining among kind of the suburban Democratic vote to say that democracy is on the ballot this time. And Summer Lee recently was the first candidate that I've seen connect it to an economic message, and I thought she did it extremely well. I want to run this by you. Basically, her tweet was something like democracy is on the ballot, and said that Republicans want an oligarchy that will prevent the government from cracking down on price gougers.
That makes total sense. I think she's absolutely right. I think it's not like the Republicans are offering any kind of coherent economic message, any kind of anti-oligarchy message, any kind of critique of corporate profiteering, which we know is at least in part, if not in majority, fueling the inflation crisis. So it's not like the Republicans are offering up a coherent plan, but they are in the minority in terms of Congress, and so they're trying to make it a referendum on the overall problem. I just don't see what their solution is. But I go back to the Democrats, and I think it's a fair question, which is, why have the Democrats focused so much on things like January 6th, things like voting rights? I mean, to be clear, and Chris and I talked about this on our podcast, to be clear, those are important issues. And I asked Chris, and this is kind of interesting, I said, does part of it have to do with the kind of nichification of the media audiences, that there's always going to be inherently a small, and by small I mean it can be 1 million people, 1.5 million people in a country of 300 million, is there's going to be an animated audience of 1 million, 1.5 million, 2 million people on MSNBC every night that's interested in the January 6th hearing, interested in the voting rights and the threat to democracy stuff. It's compelling to them, and so the sort of corporate media world focuses intently on them, even though polls consistently show it's only about 7% of the population say that's the most important issue. And he made an interesting point, which was that, listen, it's easier in the competition for attention. It's easier to make the January 6th riot images, the January 6th dramatic hearing, make that compelling on television, then arguably it is easy to make, a macroeconomic problem like inflation compelling on television. And so ultimately you get a discourse that's focusing on these, it's kind of the cat video version of politics, right? You get a discourse that's focused on these very flashy, attention grabby kind of sound bites and images, and a discourse that's not talking about the actual number one issue that people say is the most important issue to them in the election.
Right, and then it sort of teaches incorrectly Democrats that people who think that they're conditioned to believe that people care about what Stephen Colbert is talking about, or because the show is really successful, when in fact it's really a niche. And abortion, I think, is probably similar to that. We've seen a lot of focus on abortion. That doesn't mean it's not important to voters. It just means that there are a lot of priorities. And to the point, just lastly, that Ryan made about Summer Lee, it's kind of interesting to me, and David, I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, that she's saying, Republicans want this oligarchy, and I feel like the reason Democrats aren't making that argument is because Democrats also want the oligarchy.
I think, and David, she hints at that. I found the tweet, so let me read it to you. She hints at that at the end. She says, "Let's be clear about inflation. Republicans want to end democracy so they can give their billionaire corporate donors the power to jack up prices as high as they wish. If Democrats keep Congress, we have to take on big corporations and bring down prices for working people." That last line seems to be an acknowledgement that one reason her line isn't going to land as well as it might otherwise is that the audience is going to be like, okay, yeah, that's probably one reason they'd like an oligarchy, but they don't have it necessarily yet, and you're still not taking on corporate power.
It's a really good point. Look, I think there's an underlying unstated truth here, which is that when the Democratic leadership looks at all of the issues it can focus on, it tends to, over and over again, prioritize the issues that do not offend their donor class. So reproductive rights and abortion, important issue. Voting rights, important issue. January 6th, the riot, et cetera, important issue. And also they have the benefit of not offending corporate power. So the Democratic leadership is more likely to want to focus on those because it doesn't offend the big money interests that are giving the Democratic leadership money. The problem is that if you also need a compelling economic message in the middle of an inflation crisis, a message that identifies the bad guys, the villains, some of those bad guys, some of those villains are the people giving you money, the people who don't want you to make those issues salient in the election. So it's very difficult to make an economic argument about the problems that are being created, make that argument to voters without offending the donors who were the ones creating those problems. So you end up with an election happening in the middle of an economic crisis where the Democrats just aren't talking very much. As we put it at the lever, it is sort of in deference to the donors. In other words, they have gone silent out of respect or obedience to their donors. They're caught between the economy and their donors. And politically, at least in the polls, that looks like a very dangerous bet.
And they're in this weird catch-22 where consultants will tell candidates, we can't message on that in 30 seconds because it's not going to land because voters don't trust Democrats on the economy. Voters do trust the Democrats on, health care, on abortion rights, on democracy protection, those things. But we can't message on that. And so then you get this catch.
To add to that, I think on the Democratic side, as opposed to the Republican side, the Democratic consulting class has done a terrible job of envisioning how to move the polls. The Republican consulting class often are focused on how to move the polls, not just on the issues vis-a-vis the parties, but how to move the salience of the issues in voters' minds. One example, the crime issue. Crime is somewhat up in some places, not hugely. It's still below where it has been in the past. The Republicans have focused intently on crime and have made it in voters' mind the whole issue salient. That I think crime is now number 2 in the polls in terms of most important issue. And you have to say that part of the reason of that is not necessarily only the reality of the situation, but the Republicans' success in focusing on it and putting it in voters' mind as a political issue, as a voting issue in this election.
Yeah, and if the shoe were on the other foot, Democrats never would have been able to pull that off because they would have had so many people inside their coalition doing the actuallys and the fact checks. And,
I mean, think about this.
And you'd have their
consultant,
the cynical consultant being like, no, this works. And actually, though.
I mean,
listen, think about it this way. If Donald Trump was still president and there was an inflation crisis, we all know that Donald Trump would find a way to be campaigning against inflation and to be blaming inflation on the Democrats. Right. The Democrats are in power. And they can't find a way to make a compelling argument naming villains about inflation. But we know that Trump would be, and I'm not saying Trump's diagnosis would be correct. I'm just saying he would find a way. And the fact that the Democrats can't or refuse to find a similar way, I think speaks to the kind of lack of imagination, lack of creativity, and kind of political failure of the thinking of the Democratic consulting class.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were talking about that, the messaging on abortion over the course of the summer and how that sort of shifted. And there's just it's really hard to disentangle some of these variables because Democrats put millions into these ads, but then the economy, I mean, it sort of gas prices go up, then gas prices go down, but now they're back up again, and the outlook isn't so rosy. So yeah, it's been a really bad messaging cycle for Democrats just across the board.
100%. I mean, they just and last thing we should say on this is that I think if they were ever banking that the economy would go away as an important issue in the election, that's just like a lack of paying attention to the history of elections. I mean, to be clear, it's the economy, stupid, was a mantra that they made up. Like, that's their mantra. So it's completely bizarre to be in an election situation where they have effectively discarded their own famous mantra.
Well, the podcast is called Lever Time. David Sirota, founder of The Lever, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks to both of you.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.